great book of strategy from the Chinese tradition as well, that the art of war, and the idea that warfare is won or lost, right? Before, Sun Tzu says, before the very first arrow is ever shot. Violence, even well-intentioned, always rebounds upon oneself. A fascinating idea. Passage 30 will go on to talk about the leader. The leader understands the universe is forever out of control, and that trying to dominate events goes against the current of the Tao. Because he believes in himself, the leader doesn't try to convince others. Because he's content with himself, he doesn't need others' approval. Because he accepts himself, the whole world accepts him. This virtue of acceptance of Wu Wei Wu is hypercritical. In passage 31, we hear, of course, about the pacifism that's central to Taoism. Peace is the greatest good. The decent man, leader, will resort to violence only as a last resort, and he does so with great sorrow and with compassion for his enemies. Passage 37, if the powerful could center themselves in the Tao, all would be transformed and people would be content and free from desire. In passage, that 37th passage, when there is no desire, all things are at peace. Acceptance, again, is the virtue that's most celebrated here. In passage 38, we get an interesting idea. By not acting, the master leaves nothing undone. By acting, ordinary men leave much undone. Loss of the Tao can lead to empty ritual and chaos. Therefore, the master concerns himself with profound truths rather than illusion. And we think about our cave allegory of Republic 7, don't we? Passage 46 will emphasize harmony. You'll remember when we talked about declension of state in our Plato study, and we were talking about what it is that leads to groups ascending, and then why we have that declension of state on the other side of our little apex. Here, again, harmony is emphasized. Harmony with nature, harmony with the Tao in passage 46. A country will live in peace rather than prepare for war if it lives in harmony with the Tao. We should put aside the illusion of fear, put aside preparations to defend ourselves against enemies. It's an interesting concept. Machiavelli will say the exact opposite, we'll point out. In passage 53, we hear that the affluent will prosper and the poor suffer because balance is lost. To achieve balance, you got to stay centered with the Tao. In passage 57, we hear about the leader. Stop trying to control. The world governs itself. The more control you impose, the less order there will be. Now, of course, passage 57 resurrects all kinds of interesting questions about, well, what do you do, though, with a Hitler who is rising in power and has to be stopped? And the sacrifice of a large number of people has to be made in battle to stop somebody, a lunatic like Hitler. Obviously, this is what I mean by the paradoxes of this kind of thing, right? Just to finish passage 57, sounding again very much like Whitman in passage 6 of Song of Myself. Therefore, the master says, I let go of the law and people become honest. I let go of economics and people become prosperous. I let go of religion and people become serene. I let go of desire for the common good and the good becomes common as grass. Again, sounding very much like Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Passage 58. In governing a country, tolerance is preferable to repression. Attempts to force the people to change will fail. Thus, the master does not try to impose his or her will. Passage 59. The best leader is moderate, open-minded, tolerant, and then this key word and idea in Taoism of being flexible. In other words, the question is always, if the wind blows a large, strong tree, it snaps, but blows the little sapling and it just bends over to the ground. Be flexible, in other words. Passage 56, you've got a very interesting word picture. Governing a large country is like frying a small fish. You spoil it with too much poking. Very interesting. The leader should, again, govern as unobtrusively as possible. Evil will lose its power if the leader will follow the Tao. Passage 60-61 will play a similar kind of game. The greater a nation's power, the more humble it should be. A great nation acknowledges its faults and corrects them. It tends to its own affairs. It doesn't meddle in the affairs of others. To read from passage 61, a great nation's like a great man. When he makes a mistake, he realizes it. Having realized it, he admits it. Having admitted it, he corrects it. He considers those who point out his faults as his most benevolent teachers. He thinks of his enemy as the shadow that he himself casts. Wow, some compelling, some of you will say this is some of the most profound poetry we've read all year, and I would tend to agree with you on that. Passage 65, the ancient masters. Go back and take a look at Auden's poem in this regards, Monsieur de Beauart's on learnstrong.net, what the ancient masters had to say about suffering. They were never wrong, the ancient masters, the way Auden says it here. Passage 65, the ancient masters didn't try to educate the people, but kindly taught them to not know. When they think that they know the answers, people are difficult to guide. When they know that they don't know, sounding very Socratic here, right? People can find their own way. If you want to learn how to govern, avoid being clever or rich. The simplest pattern is the clearest. Content with an ordinary life, you can show all people the way back to their own true nature. It's an interesting concept. Passage 66, governing the people again requires humility. Even though the master is over the people, no one feels mastered by her. To finish that passage 66, the master is above the people and no one feels oppressed. She goes ahead of the people and no one feels manipulated. This is why often, I know I said earlier, lead from behind, but it's even a different understanding than that. The leader is obviously in front, and yet somehow the people are able to respect, and I think that's a key concept here, to respect the leader enough to allow the leader to lead. The whole world is grateful to her because she competes with no one. No one will compete with her. Passage 67 will emphasize simplicity. Those who think deeply will see that the teaching is wise. Simplicity, patience, compassion. I have just 3 things to teach, Lao Tzu says in passage 67. Simplicity, we think of Thoreau's simplify, simplify, simplify from Walden. Patience, you have to learn to labor and to wait. Remember at 3A our conversation about Longfellow's Psalm of Life. Compassion, kindness. Kindness is the most important, maybe, element. Tolerance, kindness. These 3 are your greatest treasures. Simple in actions and in thoughts, you return to the source of being. Patient with both friends and enemies, you accord with the way things are. Compassionate toward yourself, you reconcile all beings in the world. Passage 75, boy oh boy does this sound interesting. When taxes are too high, people go hungry. When the government is too intrusive, people lose their spirit. Act for the people's benefit, trust them. Leave them alone. That government is best which governs least, or as Thoreau will say, governs not at all when we get to civil disobedience. Finally, in passage 80, this notion of the country being governed wisely. The people will be content with what they have and where they live. They will enjoy the labor of their hands and not waste time inventing labor-saving machines. There's a very interesting tension here, obviously, between often what is referred to as Eastern philosophy and Western technological advancement philosophy. Well, that's our readings. Let's go quickly now to our 3 levels and ask about our big 5 to start with. What does this text say about epistemology? Well, I think that a sophomoric reading of this is that, well, this text basically argues epistemologically not for an absolutist position, but for a relativist position. Who knows what is good and what is bad? And yet I don't think so. I think rather, as we have often called it in 303 epistemologically, I think this text argues for the fallibilist position. About any position that you take, say, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. And respect the epistemological position of others. Allow others to hold views that are opposed to yours, assuming that they remain within the moral sphere. Once outside the moral sphere, as we've talked about before, then all of a sudden we have to address it, which is why, again, we have to stop tyrants like Hitler, no question. What does this text say about ontology and who we are? We're a part of the whole universe. Therefore, the quest is harmony, and by harmony, one gains peace. What do we learn about psychology from this text? Well, we have again those notions of the positive versus the negative energy. Energy conservation is huge. And to understand the motives of our actions will help us psychically to be at peace. What does this text say about politics, sociology? Well, again, it's all about harmony. It's all about unity. It's, again, back to our comments about Plato's Republic. And power is somehow redefined as not something that is imposed from on high, but something that is naturally understood when the leader allows for it to flourish. Finally, what is in our Big Five? What does this text say about theodicy and why bad things happen? And I think it's pretty clear that Lao Tzu is going to make the argument that we have to learn to stop asking, why did this happen to me? And learn to ask, why did this happen for me? That changing of the preposition from 2 to 4, as we have said many times in 303, allows one to not think of oneself as a victim in this world where bad things are happening to us, but rather we're somehow cooperating with the world. At 2a, major messages here. Less action is actually more action. Flexibility is a key, another major message. And think about the notion of the quiet life as the best life. Instead of getting caught up, for example, in lots and lots of drama in school, students often will report in their senior year, they start to see the stupidity of all of that, and they begin to become less interested in getting involved in all the silly drama that transpires in school. At 2b, and the rhetoric that we were saying we were going to focus on, notice the power of the paradox. You can take the same passage and argue both sides politically. A conservative, traditionally conservative or a liberal view can be argued from the exact same passage, which I think is what makes this such compelling reading. Obviously, we have all kinds of key symbols in the Tao Te Ching. Maybe the most powerful is water as a form that is both flexible and yet very powerful. I mean, think about it. Water is nothing, but enough of it can make the Grand Canyon. Quite remarkable, right? It's creative, we might say, as well as a symbol. What's the irony at 2b here? Well, to get what you want, you got to want less and less. You got to learn how to be content. And in that moment of contentment, you will find some sense of peace. What an interesting idea. As we have said many times in 303, this is what Scrooge in the Scrooge story, the Christmas Carol, Dickens' Christmas Carol, teaches, right? At the moment of death, everybody says the same words. Oh my God. The question is the inflection of the voice. Followers of the Tao would argue, at the moment of death, to be able to say, oh my God, with an inflection in the voice that says, this is natural. You ain't met no 200-year-old people. And you get to swing at the park, but the van is waiting. And you don't get to swing forever at the park. You've always got to go to the van at the end. And because you know that, you can have some sense of peace about that. Well, at 3a, there's so many places we could go. Plato's Republic we've mentioned. Let's put also Marcus Aurelius' meditation in our comments on Marcus Aurelius' meditations at learnstrong.net, sounding very, very similar, right? Soon you will have forgotten all things, and all things will have forgotten you. Now we're going to look at, of course, Machiavelli's Prince in our next lecture, and we're going to see some radical differences politically between these two. And then, of course, our study of Rousseau and Jefferson and the Western approach to politics, we might say, and governance, will obviously be set up against this. I mentioned Houston Smith's Religions of the World. Guys, get that book and take a look. It's an amazing, non-apologetic way to take a look at the study of religions. I've mentioned Blake already, Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience. Go back and take a look at our comments at learnstrong.net on that. And now finally, to finish, how can we relate this information to ourselves personally? What are your thoughts on this type of philosophic idea? Does it work for you? Do you think it's possible? Is control really, in the end, about grabbing hold or about letting go? The word picture sometimes is, how do you hold on to a bar of soap? You grab hold of it too tightly, it slips out. Grab hold of it too loosely, it falls. That ability to find a balance. Can you do that, do you think, in your life? In the end, do you think harmony is the key? And do you think you could find ways to be more harmonious? How do you feel about trying to find some harmony in your life as a quest? I mean, think about it. There's that whole notion in our study in AP of the quest, of the journey. What if the most important journey, though, is not the journey out, but the journey in? What if the most important thing is not growing up, but waking up? And what if part of waking up is learning how to come to terms with your energy conservation, as we talked about? Well, I hope that our study here has led you to want to know more about the Tao Te Ching. Maybe go online and read all of the 81 poems. As Houston Smith said, you can read it in an hour, read it in a lifetime. I just want to finish by sharing two passages that are my favorite from the Tao Te Ching. The first is passage 11. And you know how we always ask, what is 303? Is it the walls or the space within the walls? You'll now know where that question comes from in passage 11. 30 spokes, unite around one hub to make a wheel. It's the presence of the empty space that gives the function of a vehicle. Clay's molded into a vessel. It's the empty space that gives the function of a vessel. Doors and windows are chiseled out to make a room. It's the empty space in the room that gives its function. Therefore, something substantial can be beneficial, while the emptiness of void is what can be utilized. Beautiful. Now, finally, passage 25, which was also a favorite of Houston Smith's. Something is formed in the chaos which existed before heaven and earth. It is quiet and profound. It stands alone and alters not. It revolves eternally without exhaustion. It's regarded as the mother of all beings. I do not know its name except to call it Tao. When forced to give it a name, I would call it the Great. The Great is far-reaching. Far-reaching is infinite. Infinite is to return to the self-sufficient origin. Therefore, Tao is great, heaven is great, earth is great, and so is the true self. There are 4 greatnesses in the universe, and true self is one of them. Man models the way of earth. Earth models the way of heaven. Heaven models the way of Tao. Tao models the way of nature. I hope that your next walk in the mountains will maybe help you reflect on that passage. Thank you.